The explosion sent smoke billowing from the shed at the edge of Belmont, Nevada, and Delilah Vaughn emerged covered in soot, coughing but grinning like she had just discovered gold. It was April 1882, and the mining town nestled in the Tokemaa Range had seen its share of unusual characters, but none quite like the 22-year-old woman who insisted on building contraptions that most folks said would never amount to anything. Her father had been an engineer before consumption took him 3 years back, leaving Delilah with his workshop, his tools, and a mind that never stopped spinning with ideas. The townspeople called her eccentric at best and downright foolish at worst, shaking their heads whenever they passed her property and heard the clanging of metal or the hiss of steam. Preston Sinclair had been working cattle drives since he was 16, spending most of his 24 years in the saddle moving livestock from one territory to another. He had arrived in Belmont 2 weeks earlier, hired by the local ranchers to help manage their herds through the spring season. Unlike most cowboys who spent their evenings at the saloon throwing back whiskey and playing cards, Preston had a curious nature that drew him to things others overlooked. He had noticed the strange shed with its chimney pipe, and the young woman who seemed to live more in her workshop than in the modest house beside it. When the explosion rattled the windows of the boarding house where he was staying, Preston grabbed his hat and headed toward the source of the commotion. Delilah was brushing ash from her split riding skirt when she saw the tall cowboy approaching. Most people came running to gawk or lecture, but this one moved with purpose, his brown eyes scanning the shed for damage rather than judgment. His dark hair needed a trim, and trail dust still clung to his worn vest. But there was something steady about him that made Delilah lower her guard just slightly. "You hurt?" Preston asked, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl that spoke of years spent under open skies. "Just my pride," Delilah said, wiping her forehead and leaving another smudge. "The pressure valve failed sooner than I calculated." Preston stepped closer, peering into the shed where her latest invention sat amid the wreckage. It looked like a combination of a water pump and a heating element, with pipes running in directions that seemed to defy logic. "What's it supposed to do?" The simple question, asked without mockery or condescension, caught Delilah off guard. She had grown so accustomed to defending her work that genuine interest felt foreign. "It is a washing apparatus. It heats water and agitates clothes mechanically. The women in this town spend hours scrubbing laundry by hand. This could reduce that time to minutes." Preston nodded slowly, studying the twisted metal and scattered components. "The valve is your weak point. You are using too much pressure for that gauge." "You know about pressure systems?" Delilah asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Worked on a steam-powered sawmill in Colorado for a spell. The foreman there taught me some things before I went back to cattle." Preston picked up a piece of copper piping, examining the threading. "You need a release mechanism that engages before it reaches critical levels." For the first time since her father died, Delilah felt the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. "Would you help me rebuild it?" Preston glanced at the sun, calculating the hours until his next shift with the cattle. "I have got time now. Show me your plans." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the shed, Delilah explaining her designs while Preston offered practical suggestions drawn from his varied experience. He did not laugh when she described her idea for a mechanical butter churner, or raise his eyebrows at her sketches for a device that could help miners detect dangerous gases. Instead, he asked questions that showed he was actually thinking about how these inventions could work, rather than why they would fail. By the time the sun started its descent toward the mountains, they had formulated a plan to reinforce the pressure system with a better valve and a secondary release pipe. Delilah's hands were stained with grease, and Preston had shed his vest in the warmth of the shed, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with old rope burns and sun. "I should get back," Preston said finally. "I am supposed to help move cattle to the northern pasture at dawn." "Thank you," Delilah said, and she meant it in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. "Most people just laugh." "Most people are afraid of anything they do not understand," Preston replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I will come by tomorrow evening if you want to continue." "I would like that." Preston tipped his hat and headed back toward town, and Delilah stood in the doorway of her shed watching him go. She told herself it was simply relief at finding someone who took her seriously. But there was something else stirring beneath that relief, something warm and unfamiliar that had nothing to do with steam pressure or mechanical engineering. The next evening brought Preston back as promised, and the evening after that. Word spread through Belmont that the new cowboy was spending his free time at the Vaughn place, and the gossip mills churned as reliably as Delilah hoped her inventions would. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Patterson, made pointed comments about propriety. The ranch foreman, Charlie Hewitt, ribbed Preston about getting distracted by a pretty face. The ladies at the general store whispered that poor Delilah Vaughn was setting herself up for heartbreak, chasing both impossible dreams and a drifter who would move on with the next cattle drive. But Preston kept coming back, and slowly the washing apparatus took shape. They worked in comfortable stretches of silence, broken by bursts of conversation that ranged from technical problems to personal stories. Delilah learned that Preston's parents had died of fever when he was young, leaving him and his older brother to make their own way. His brother had settled in Kansas with a wife and farm, but Preston had never felt the pull of staying in one place. He talked about the territories he had seen, the strange rock formations in Arizona, and the endless grasslands of Montana, and Delilah listened with the hunger of someone who had spent her whole life in mining towns watching the same mountains. Preston learned that Delilah had taught herself advanced mathematics from her father's books, that she had once written to a university in California asking if they accepted female students and received no reply, that she invented things because it was the only way she knew to feel like she was moving forward instead of staying stuck. Her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Delilah was 12, and her father had thrown himself into his work afterward, teaching his daughter everything he knew as if he could sense his own time was limited. "Do you ever want to leave Belmont?" Preston asked one evening as they tested the water heating element. Delilah watched steam rise from the basin, her invention finally holding pressure without exploding. "I used to dream about it constantly, going to San Francisco or even back east, where there are universities and factories. But after my father died, I inherited the property, and selling it would not bring enough to start over somewhere else. So I stayed, and I kept building. What if one of your inventions really works? What if people want to buy it? Then maybe I could afford to dream again," Delilah said softly. She turned to look at Preston, his face illuminated by the lamplight, and felt her breath catch at the way he was watching her. Not with pity or amusement, but with something that looked almost like admiration. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, until Preston cleared his throat and pointed to the gauge. "Pressure is holding steady. We should test the agitation mechanism." They fed old rags into the basin, and Delilah engaged the mechanical paddle system she had designed. The paddles rotated smoothly, moving the fabric through the heated water in rhythmic swooshes that sounded like success. Preston let out a whoop that made Delilah laugh, and before she could think better of it, she threw her arms around him in celebration. Preston stiffened for just a second before his arms came up around her waist, holding her against his chest. Delilah could feel his heart beating fast beneath his shirt, matching the pace of her own. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and the expression on his face made her stomach flip. "Delilah," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I should tell you that I am not good at staying." "I know," she whispered, but she did not step away. "I have moved from job to job for 8 years, never spent more than a season in one place." "I know," she repeated, "but being here, working with you, it makes me want things I have never wanted before." Delilah reached up and touched his jaw, feeling the scratch of several days' stubble. "What kind of things?" Instead of answering, Preston lowered his head and kissed her. It was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, and Delilah answered by pressing closer. The kiss deepened, became something urgent and sweet all at once, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "That kind of thing," Preston said, and despite the seriousness of the moment, Delilah laughed. They stood in the shed surrounded by her invention, holding each other as the steam slowly dissipated and the spring evening grew cool. Neither spoke about what came next, but both felt the weight of it hanging between them like a promise that neither quite knew how to keep. Over the following weeks, Preston and Delilah fell into a pattern. He worked the cattle during the day, and she managed her household and continued sketching designs. In the evenings, they met at the shed and worked on her inventions together. The washing apparatus was refined until it ran smoothly for hours without failure. They built a demonstration model of the butter churner that actually produced butter faster than the manual method. Preston even helped her construct a ventilation device for mines that used a wind-powered fan system to pull fresh air into the shafts. But their relationship was no longer just about inventions. Preston started arriving with wildflowers he picked on the range, and Delilah began packing extra portions of her supper to share with him. They stole kisses between testing mechanisms, and their conversations grew more personal. Preston admitted that he had been running from the loneliness of losing his family, afraid that settling down meant opening himself up to that kind of loss again. Delilah confessed that her inventions were partly a way to prove to herself that she mattered, that she could create something lasting in a world that seemed determined to forget her. The first real test of their relationship came when Delilah decided to demonstrate the washing apparatus publicly. She arranged to set it up in the town square on a Saturday morning when the market was in full swing. Preston helped her haul the device from her shed, loading it onto a borrowed wagon and securing it carefully. A crowd gathered as Delilah began her presentation, explaining how the apparatus worked while Preston stood beside her, offering steady support. Several women watched with cautious interest, their hands red and raw from years of scrubbing clothes on washboards. But the men, particularly the older ones who held the town's purse strings, started making comments. "What does a woman know about engineering?" one merchant called out. "This is going to blow up just like all her other foolishness." "My wife does not need a machine," another man declared. "Hard work never hurt anyone." The barber laughed outright. "Preston, you have gone soft in the head, wasting your time on this nonsense." Delilah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chin up as she poured water into the basin and lit the heating element. Preston moved closer, his presence a solid comfort at her shoulder. He did not say anything to defend her, understanding instinctively that she needed to prove herself, but his quiet support spoke louder than any words. The apparatus heated up, pressure building exactly as designed. Delilah added dirty work shirts and engaged the agitation mechanism. The paddles began their rotation, and within minutes the shirts were visibly cleaner. She let the machine run through a full cycle while the crowd watched, some skeptical, some curious, and a few genuinely impressed. When she pulled out the shirts, steaming and clean, and hung them on a line for inspection, the laughter died away. The women pressed forward, examining the fabric and murmuring to each other. One rancher's wife, a practical woman named Sarah Chen, whose husband had come from California during the gold rush, spoke up. "How much would one of these cost?" Delilah had not actually thought that far ahead. "I would need to calculate the materials and labor, maybe $40. "That is 2 months' wages for most folks," the merchant scoffed. "No one is going to pay that for something that does what a washboard does fine." "A washboard takes 3 hours and tears up your hands," Sarah retorted. "This took 20 minutes and my hands never touched the water. I would save that in doctor's visits for rheumatism alone." Another woman nodded. "My daughter would buy one. She is running a boarding house in Austin and has laundry every single day." The conversation shifted as women began talking among themselves about the possibilities while the men stood back, some still dismissive, but others thoughtful. Preston caught Delilah's eye and smiled, a private expression of pride that made her heart swell. The demonstration ended without any firm orders, but it had planted seeds. Over the next few days, 3 women approached Delilah privately about purchasing washing apparatuses. She threw herself into building them, and Preston helped whenever he could, but his time was increasingly limited. The spring cattle season was ending, and the ranch foreman was already talking about the next job, a drive up to Oregon that would take most of the summer. Preston had not mentioned the Oregon drive to Delilah yet, and the omission sat between them like a stone. They were in the shed one evening in early June, working on the 3rd washing apparatus, when Delilah finally brought it up. "Charlie said you were leaving in 2 weeks. Preston's hand stilled on the pipe he was fitting. "I was going to talk to you about it." "When? The night before you left?" "I do not know what to say, Delilah. This is what I do. I work cattle drives." Delilah set down her wrench with more force than necessary. "I am not asking you to give up your work. I am asking you to be honest with me about what this is between us." Preston stood, frustration clear on his face. "What do you want me to say? That I am falling in love with you? Because I am, and it terrifies me. I have never had a reason to stay anywhere before." "So I am not reason enough?" The words came out sharper than Delilah intended, edged with all the fear she had been carrying. "That is not fair. You have your whole life here, your work, your property. I cannot ask you to give that up." "You have not asked me anything," Delilah's voice rose. "You just keep making decisions alone and expecting me to accept them." They stared at each other across the shed, the air thick with unspoken things. Preston removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Delilah had learned meant he was struggling to find the right words. "I am scared," he admitted finally. "Everyone I have ever cared about has left or died. My parents, my brother might as well be a stranger now. I have spent years not getting attached because it is easier than losing people." Delilah felt her anger soften into something achingly tender. "You think I am not scared too? I am building machines because connecting with people has brought me nothing but loss. But then you showed up and started helping instead of laughing, and suddenly I want things I thought I had given up on." Preston crossed the space between them and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I do not want to lose you." "Then do not leave. The ranch job here ends in 2 weeks. If I do not take the Oregon Drive, I will not have work." Delilah covered his hands with hers. "What if you stayed and helped me build a real business? The orders are starting to come. I need help not just with construction, but with everything. Someone to manage sales, handle deliveries, test new designs. I cannot pay much yet, but if this works, if people actually want what I am creating, then maybe it could support both of us." Preston searched her face, wanting to believe it was possible. "You would want me as a partner?" "In every sense of the word," Delilah said firmly. "If you want that too." The kiss he gave her was his answer, deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, Preston was smiling in a way that made him look younger, less burdened by years of wandering. "I need to give Charlie proper notice and finish out the season here," Preston said. "But after that, I am yours if you will have me." "I will have you," Delilah whispered, and sealed it with another kiss. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Preston fulfilled his obligations to the ranch while spending every spare hour helping Delilah complete the orders for washing apparatuses. They delivered the first one to Sarah Chen, who immediately put it to use and declared it a miracle. Word spread faster after that, and 2 more orders came in from neighboring towns. On Preston's last day working cattle, Charlie Hewitt pulled him aside after they had finished herding stock into the southern pasture. The foreman was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough of life to recognize something real when he saw it. "You are staying for the girl," Charlie said. It was not a question. "I am staying to build something," Preston replied. "The girl just happens to be the smartest, most stubborn person I have ever met." Charlie grinned. "You have got it bad, Sinclair. But I will say this, she has got more grit than half the men in this territory. You could do worse than hitching your wagon to hers." "I know," Preston said simply. That evening, Preston moved his few belongings from the boarding house to Delilah's property. She had cleaned out the small room off the workshop that her father had once used as an office, and it would serve as Preston's space until they figured out something more permanent. Mrs. Patterson made pointed remarks about impropriety, but Delilah ignored her. They were adults making their own choices, and anyone who had a problem with it could keep their opinions to themselves. As summer settled over Nevada, Preston and Delilah fell into a working rhythm that felt like its own kind of courtship. They rose early, sharing coffee while discussing the day's projects. Preston proved to have a talent for sales, presenting Delilah's inventions to potential buyers with an enthusiasm that came from genuine belief in their worth. He also started suggesting modifications based on feedback from customers, practical improvements that made the designs more user-friendly. The butter churner was their next success. Delilah had designed a mechanical system that used a hand crank to agitate cream much faster than the traditional up-and-down plunger method. Preston built a demonstration model and took it to the local dairy farmer, a Swedish immigrant named Henrik Lindström, who supplied butter to most of the town. Henrik was skeptical at first, but after using the churner himself and seeing how much time it saved, he ordered 2 on the spot and promised to recommend them to other dairy operations. By late July, Delilah had a waiting list of orders. She hired 2 young men from town to help with the metalwork, training them in her father's workshop, while Preston managed the business side of things. The income was modest but steady, enough to cover expenses and start saving toward expansion. Their relationship deepened alongside their business partnership. Preston was attentive in ways Delilah had never experienced, remembering small details like how she preferred her tea and that her right shoulder ached after hours of working with heavy tools. He would rub the knots from her muscles while she read aloud from engineering journals she ordered from San Francisco. Delilah, in turn, learned that Preston had nightmares sometimes, remnants of his years alone on the trail, and she would hold him until the tension left his body and he fell back into peaceful sleep. They had not discussed marriage yet, both aware that their arrangement was unconventional enough without adding legal complications. But the question hung in the air between them, unspoken but present, especially when townspeople made comments about their situation. The turning point came in September, when a businessman from Virginia City visited Belmont. His name was Robert Thornton, and he owned a manufacturing company that produced farm equipment. He had heard about Delilah's washing apparatus from a client and wanted to see it for himself. Preston and Delilah set up a demonstration at the workshop, showing Thornton not just the washing apparatus, but also the butter churner and the mine ventilation system. Thornton examined everything with a critical eye, asking detailed questions about materials, production costs, and potential markets. "Miss Vaughn," he said finally, "these designs are remarkable. I would like to propose a partnership. My company has the facilities to manufacture these inventions on a much larger scale. We could produce hundreds of units and distribute them throughout the Western Territories and possibly even back east." Delilah's heart raced. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about. "What kind of partnership?" "I would purchase the rights to manufacture your designs. In exchange, you would receive a percentage of sales and credit as the inventor. You could continue developing new products, and we would have first rights to produce anything you create." It sounded perfect, almost too perfect. Preston, standing beside Delilah, spoke up. "What percentage are we talking about?" Thornton quoted a figure that was lower than Preston thought fair, and negotiations began. Over the next hour, Preston proved himself to be a shrewd businessman, pushing back on Thornton's initial offer and advocating for better terms. Delilah watched in admiration as the cowboy who had shown up to help her rebuild an exploded invention transformed into a skilled negotiator who clearly had her best interests at heart. They finally settled on terms that gave Delilah a fair percentage of profits, maintained her rights to any designs not explicitly sold to Thornton's company, and included an advance payment substantial enough to fund further research and development. Thornton left with detailed plans and measurements, promising to have the first production run completed within 3 months. After Thornton's wagon disappeared down the road toward Virginia City, Delilah turned to Preston with tears in her eyes. "Did that really just happen?" Preston swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing instead of crying. "You did it. Your inventions worked, and now the whole territory is going to know your name." "We did it," Delilah corrected. "I never would have gotten this far without you." Preston set her down, but kept his arms around her waist. "Delilah Vaughn, I came to this town planning to pass through like I have passed through every other place. But you made me want to stay. You made me want to build something real and lasting. I love you more than I thought I could love anything, and I want to spend the rest of my life helping you turn your brilliant ideas into reality." Preston Sinclair, I spent years being laughed at and dismissed, convinced I would end up alone with nothing but my inventions to show for my life. Then you walked into my workshop after an explosion and asked how you could help instead of telling me I was foolish. You have given me something I did not know I was missing, someone who believes in me and stands beside me. I love you with everything I have. They kissed there in the yard, the September sun warm on their faces and the future spreading out before them full of promise. When they broke apart, Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was simple silver with a small turquoise stone, the kind of thing a cowboy on modest wages could afford. "I know we have been living unconventionally," Preston said, suddenly nervous, "and I know you do not need a husband to be successful or complete, but I want to marry you, Delilah. I want everyone to know that I am yours and you are mine. Will you marry me?" Delilah looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, and felt certainty settle over her like a blessing. Yes, I will marry you." The ring fit perfectly, and they spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. They decided on a simple ceremony at the small church in Belmont, with just a few close friends in attendance. Sarah Chen helped Delilah make a dress from cream-colored silk ordered from San Francisco, and Charlie Hewitt agreed to stand up as Preston's witness. The local preacher, a kind man named Reverend Matthews, performed the ceremony on a crisp October afternoon, with golden aspen leaves falling outside the church windows. Delilah wore wildflowers in her hair that Preston had picked that morning, and Preston wore a new vest that Delilah had commissioned from the tailor as a wedding gift. They exchanged vows with steady voices, promising to support each other through whatever came, and when Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation applauded. The reception was held at Delilah's property, now legally theirs together. Tables were set up in the yard, and neighbors brought food and drink to share. Even some of the men who had laughed at Delilah's inventions showed up, their attitudes softened by her success and their respect for Preston's steady character. The celebration lasted into the evening, with Henrik Lindstrom playing fiddle while couples danced under the stars. When the last guests finally left, Preston and Delilah stood together in the doorway of their home, looking out at the workshop where their partnership had begun. "Are you happy?" Preston asked, pulling his wife close. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Delilah replied, leaning into his warmth. "Are you sorry you gave up the wandering life?" "Not for a single second. I was not running toward anything out there. I was just running. But here with you, I have finally found where I am supposed to be." They went inside and closed the door on the rest of the world, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The following months brought changes both expected and surprising. Thornton's company began producing the washing apparatuses, and they sold faster than anyone anticipated. Orders came from mining towns throughout Nevada, from ranches in California, and even from as far away as Colorado. Delilah received letters from women thanking her for creating something that made their lives easier, and each letter felt like validation for all the years of being dismissed and overlooked. With the income from sales, Preston and Delilah expanded the workshop and hired more help. They moved into a larger house they built on the property, a sturdy structure with a real parlor and a bedroom big enough for the double bed they ordered from a catalog. Delilah turned her father's old office into a proper design studio where she could work on new inventions without the noise and chaos of the workshop. Preston proved to have a head for business that complemented Delilah's creative genius. He established relationships with suppliers to get better prices on materials, organized the workflow to maximize efficiency, and even started corresponding with potential clients in other territories. He never tried to take credit for Delilah's designs or diminish her role, always making it clear to everyone that she was the inventor and he was simply helping bring her visions to life. Their marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm of partnership and passion. They worked together during the day, often getting so absorbed in a project that they forgot to eat until hunger finally drove them to the kitchen. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Delilah sketching, while Preston read or worked on ledgers. At night, they came together with a tenderness and heat that deepened as they learned each other's bodies and desires. By the spring of 1883, a year after Preston first arrived in Belmont, Delilah realized she was pregnant. She had missed 2 monthly cycles and woke several mornings feeling nauseated, and while the signs were clear, she waited until she was certain before telling Preston. She found him in the workshop one afternoon, teaching one of their employees how to properly solder copper joints, and pulled him aside. "I need to tell you something," she said, suddenly nervous despite their close relationship. Preston immediately focused on her, concern crossing his face. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Actually, something is very right. I am going to have a baby." For a moment, Preston simply stared at her, processing the information. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop that echoed through the workshop. He picked her up and spun her around just like he had when Thornton made his offer, and Delilah laughed at the joy radiating from him. "We are going to be parents," Preston said, setting her down carefully, as if she were suddenly made of glass. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you even be in the workshop with all the fumes?" "I am fine," Delilah assured him, touched by his immediate concern. Women have been having babies while continuing their lives for all of human history. I am not going to suddenly become fragile. But Preston fussed anyway, insisting she take more breaks and refusing to let her lift anything heavy. It was simultaneously annoying and endearing, and Delilah let him mother her because she understood it came from love rather than a belief that pregnancy made her incapable. As her belly grew over the summer months, Delilah worked on a new invention, a mechanical cradle that rocked with a wind-up mechanism so parents could soothe the baby without having to stand there manually rocking. It seemed fitting to be creating something for her own child while preparing to meet them. Preston spent his spare time building furniture for the nursery, a crib and changing table crafted with meticulous care. He had never worked much with wood, preferring metal and mechanical systems, but he approached furniture making with the same determination he brought to everything else. The results were sturdy, if not elegant, and Delilah loved each piece because Preston had made them with his own hands for their child. The baby came in late November, arriving after a labor that lasted through a long night and into the next morning. Sarah Chen served as midwife, having helped deliver dozens of babies in Belmont, and Preston stayed by Delilah's side the entire time, holding her hand and offering whatever comfort he could. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Sarah announced that they had a healthy son. Preston cut the cord with shaking hands, and when Sarah placed the cleaned and wrapped baby in Delilah's arms, both parents cried. Their son had a shock of dark hair and his father's brown eyes, and he quieted immediately when he heard Delilah's voice, the sound familiar from months in the womb. "What should we name him?" Delilah asked, exhausted but exhilarated. Preston touched the baby's tiny hand, watching in wonder as miniature fingers closed around his larger one. "What about James, after your father?" Delilah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "James Sinclair. It is perfect." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. James was a colicky baby who seemed to prefer being awake at night, and Preston and Delilah took turns walking the floor with him, singing songs and telling stories until he finally settled. The workshop time was reduced significantly, but they managed to keep up with orders by relying more heavily on their trained employees. Delilah discovered that she loved being a mother, though it was harder than any invention she had ever attempted. The constant vigilance, the worry, the way her heart seemed to exist outside her body now, vulnerable in the form of this tiny person who depended entirely on her and Preston. But watching Preston with their son, seeing the gentle way he cradled James and the wonder that never left his face, made every sleepless night worth it. By the time James was 6 months old and starting to sleep through the night more regularly, Delilah began working on a new project. She had been thinking about irrigation systems, specifically ways to help small farms and ranches get water to crops and livestock more efficiently. Nevada was dry country, and water management could make the difference between success and failure for many families. Preston listened to her ideas and immediately saw the potential. They began experimenting with windmill-powered pumps, using the constant Nevada wind to draw water from underground sources. It took months of trial and error, multiple failures that sent them back to the drawing board, but they eventually created a system that worked reliably and could be built relatively inexpensively. Henrik Lindstrom was their first customer for the irrigation system, installing it on his dairy farm to ensure his cattle always had access to water. The results were immediately positive, and within weeks other ranchers and farmers were inquiring about purchasing their own systems. As James grew from baby to toddler, he spent his days in the workshop, playing with wood scraps and watching his parents work. He was a curious child, always asking questions about how things worked and why, and both Preston and Delilah encouraged his inquisitive nature. By the time he was 3 years old, James could identify most of the basic tools and loved to help by handing his parents whatever they needed. In the summer of 1886, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, her body having learned what to expect. Preston was no less attentive but slightly less panicked, trusting that Delilah knew her own limits. They prepared James for the arrival of a sibling, though at 4 years old, he was not entirely sure what that meant. Their daughter was born in February 1887, arriving quickly and efficiently, as if she had places to be and things to do. She had Delilah's auburn hair and Preston's stubborn chin, and they named her Eleanor after Preston's mother. James was initially skeptical of this small creature who took up so much of his parents' attention, but he quickly became protective of his baby sister, always wanting to help feed her or bring her toys. With 2 children, life became even more chaotic. The house rang with laughter and occasional tears, and toys seemed to multiply in every corner. But Preston and Delilah navigated parenthood as they did everything else, as partners who supported each other through the challenges and celebrated the victories together. The business continued to grow. Thornton's company expanded into eastern markets, and Delilah's name became known among women interested in labor-saving devices. She received invitations to speak at various gatherings, though she turned most of them down, preferring to focus on her work and family rather than becoming a public figure. But she did agree to write articles about her inventions for several magazines, spreading her ideas further than Belmont, Nevada, could have ever reached alone. Preston had long since stopped thinking of himself as a cowboy drifting from job to job. He was a businessman now, a husband and father, someone who had put down roots so deep that the thought of leaving made no sense whatsoever. He still missed the open trail sometimes, the simplicity of cattle and sky, but what he had built with Delilah was worth more than all the freedom in the world. On their 5th wedding anniversary in October 1888, Preston and Delilah hired Sarah Chen to watch James and Eleanor for the evening, and took a rare night to themselves. They rode horses up into the Tacoma Range, climbing to a high meadow where they could see Belmont spread out below them, the lights just beginning to twinkle as dusk fell. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Delilah asked, sitting beside Preston on a flat rock while their horses grazed nearby. "When the washing apparatus exploded? I remember thinking you looked completely insane, covered in soot and grinning like it was the best day of your life," Preston said with affection. "I remember you asking what it was supposed to do instead of telling me I was foolish for trying. That was the moment everything changed." Preston took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I never laughed at you." "No, you never did. You helped me test every crazy idea, even when you probably thought some of them would not work. You believed in me when I was not sure I believed in myself anymore. It was easy to believe in you. Your mind works in ways I cannot fully comprehend, seeing solutions where everyone else sees problems. I just helped make your visions real." Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder. "We make a good team." "The best team," Preston agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I was thinking about expanding again, maybe opening a second workshop, training more people in your methods. We could hire someone to manage the day-to-day operations while we focus on new designs." "Always thinking ahead," Delilah said fondly. "What brought this on?" "James asked me yesterday what I did before I met you. I told him about working cattle drives, moving from place to place, and he looked at me like I was describing a completely different person, which I suppose I was. Then he asked if I was happy now, and I realized I have never been happier in my entire life. I want to keep building this life with you, keep growing and creating new things." "I want that too," Delilah said, "though I also would not mind taking some time to just enjoy what we have. The children are growing so fast, and I do not want to miss it by being constantly focused on the next project." "You are right," Preston acknowledged. "We can pace ourselves. We have time." They watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Delilah thought about all the years she had spent alone in her workshop, convinced that her inventions were all she would ever have. She had been wrong in the best possible way. Her inventions had brought her success and recognition, but Preston had brought her love and partnership and a family she cherished more than any achievement. "Thank you," she said quietly. For what?" "For showing up that day after the explosion, for staying, for loving me and believing in me and building this life with me, for being exactly who you are." Preston kissed her temple. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally stop running. Thank you for showing me that home is not a place, but the people you choose to be with. Thank you for James and Eleanor and every single day I get to spend as your husband." They rode back down the mountain as stars emerged overhead, the horses picking their way carefully through the darkness. When they reached home, Sarah reported that the children had been angels, though the proud glint in her eye suggested they had tested her patience at least once or twice. After she left, Preston and Delilah checked on James and Eleanor, both sleeping peacefully in their beds, before retiring to their own room. They made love slowly that night, relearning each other's bodies with the comfort of long familiarity mixed with the spark that had never quite faded. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Preston said, "I love you more now than the day I married you." "How is that possible when you love me enough to give up the wandering life?" Delilah asked. "Because every day with you teaches me new ways to love. Every challenge we face together, every success we celebrate, every moment with our children, it all adds layers to what I feel for you. I did not know love could keep growing like this." Delilah kissed him, putting into the kiss everything she felt but could not quite articulate. When she finally pulled back, she whispered, "I love you too, more than words can properly express." The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children and the steady growth of their business. James showed an early aptitude for mathematics and design, often sitting with Delilah in her studio to watch her sketch. Eleanor, by contrast, was fascinated by the business side of things, asking Preston endless questions about money and customers and how they decided what to charge for different inventions. In 1890, Delilah created her most ambitious invention yet, a combination washing and drying apparatus that used heated rollers to press water from clothes after they were cleaned. It was expensive to produce and required significant space, making it impractical for most individual households, but commercial laundries and large boarding houses immediately saw its value. Thornton's company began manufacturing it for institutional clients, and the resulting income allowed Preston and Delilah to finally hire the management help they had discussed years earlier. With more time freed up, they began traveling occasionally, taking the children to San Francisco to see the ocean and to Sacramento to visit museums. James and Eleanor were wide-eyed at the bustling cities, so different from Belmont's quiet streets. But they were always happy to return home, to the familiar workshop and the wide Nevada sky. Preston's brother, Matthew, came to visit in the spring of 1892, bringing his wife and 3 children. It was the first time the brothers had seen each other in over a decade, and the reunion was emotional. Matthew marveled at how Preston had changed, from the restless young man who could not stay in one place to this settled family man with a thriving business. "You found your place," Matthew said on the last night of their visit, sitting on the porch with Preston while the women got the children ready for bed. "I always worried you would just drift forever." "I probably would have if Delilah had not exploded her washing apparatus the week I arrived in Belmont," Preston said with a smile. "Funny how one moment can change your entire life." "It was not just one moment. It was you choosing to help instead of walking away. It was you choosing to stay instead of taking the next job. You made those choices, Preston." "I suppose I did. Best choices I ever made." Matthew left the next morning, promising to visit again soon, and Preston felt a sense of peace about his relationship with his brother that had been missing for years. They had taken different paths, but both had found happiness, and that was all that mattered. As the decade progressed, Preston and Delilah began to think about the future beyond just their own lives. They established a scholarship fund for young people interested in engineering and design, specifically targeting women who faced the same barriers Delilah had encountered. They also started training programs in the workshop, teaching local youth practical skills in metalworking and mechanics that could lead to good employment. James, now in his teenage years, was designing his own inventions with his mother's guidance. He had created a better mousetrap and an improved lantern design that used less oil, and he talked constantly about wanting to attend university to study engineering. Preston and Delilah encouraged him, setting aside money for his education and making sure he understood that his opportunities came partly from luck, but also from hard work and perseverance. Eleanor, at 11 years old, announced that she wanted to run the business when she grew up. She had been sitting in on meetings with Thornton and other business associates, taking notes and asking sharp questions that often surprised the men who were not accustomed to being challenged by a child. Delilah and Preston had no doubt she would accomplish whatever she set her mind to. In the fall of 1895, Belmont threw a celebration honoring Delilah's contributions to the town and the territory. What had started as a small mining community was now thriving partly because of the employment and recognition her inventions had brought. The mayor gave a speech praising her ingenuity, and several women spoke about how her washing apparatus had changed their lives. Delilah stood on the makeshift stage in the town square, Preston beside her with James and Eleanor in front of them, and looked out at the crowd. She saw faces of people who had once laughed at her, who had dismissed her as a foolish woman playing at engineering. But she also saw the women whose lives were easier because of her work, the young people who now had opportunities they might not have had otherwise, and the community that had slowly come to accept and even celebrate her unconventional path. "I am not good at speeches," Delilah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I would rather build things than talk about them. But I want to say that everything I have accomplished has been possible because of the people who believed in me. My father, who taught me that curiosity is not something to be ashamed of, but something to cultivate. Sarah Chen and the other women who took a chance on my inventions when they were still unproven. Robert Thornton, who saw commercial potential where others saw only risk. She paused and looked at Preston, who smiled encouragingly. And most of all, my husband Preston. When everyone else laughed at my inventions, he never did. When my experiments failed, he helped me figure out what went wrong and try again. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of what I was capable of. He has been my partner in every sense of the word, and I would not be standing here today without him. The crowd applauded, and Preston looked slightly embarrassed, but pleased. James and Eleanor were grinning, clearly proud of their parents, and Delilah felt a wave of gratitude for everything her life had become. The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing, and Delilah and Preston slipped away during a lull to walk through town together. They passed the general store where Delilah used to buy supplies while enduring pitying looks, the boarding house where Preston had first stayed, and eventually made their way to the property that had been Delilah's alone, but was now theirs together. The workshop was dark and quiet, the employees having left for the day. Preston and Delilah went inside, walking through the space that held so many memories. The first washing apparatus they had built together was displayed in a corner, a monument to where everything had started. "Do you ever miss it?" Delilah asked. "The simplicity of when it was just you and me in this shed, trying to keep things from exploding?" "Sometimes," Preston admitted. "But I would not trade what we have now for anything. Our lives are more complicated, but they are also fuller. We have built something together that extends beyond just us." "We have," Delilah agreed, "and we are still building." They walked back to the house hand in hand, finding James and Eleanor already home and arguing amiably about something neither parent could quite follow. Delilah settled the dispute with the wisdom of long practice, and Preston made them all hot chocolate to wind down from the excitement of the day. Later, after the children were in bed, Delilah and Preston sat together in their bedroom, simply existing in each other's presence. They did not need to fill every silence with words anymore. The comfort of their partnership allowed for quiet moments that spoke as loudly as any conversation. "Are you happy?" Preston asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding night all those years ago. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Delilah replied, also echoing her previous answer. "Are you?" "Beyond measure. I found what I was looking for, even though I did not know I was searching for it." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, two people who had found their place in the world by finding each other. The years rolled on with the steady rhythm of a life well lived. James went off to university in California, studying engineering just as he had dreamed. He wrote letters home describing his classes and the new designs he was working on, and every word filled his parents with pride. Eleanor took over more responsibilities in the business, showing a natural talent for negotiation and strategy that reminded Preston of himself at that age. In 1898, Delilah was invited to speak at a women's conference in San Francisco. She initially declined, uncomfortable with public speaking, but Preston encouraged her to accept. "Your story matters," he told her. "There are young women out there who need to hear that it is possible to pursue unconventional dreams and succeed." So, Delilah went, with Preston accompanying her for support, and she spoke to a room full of women about her journey from dismissed inventor to successful businesswoman. She talked about the failures and the mockery, but also about the importance of persistence and finding people who believed in you. The response was overwhelming, with women approaching her afterward to share their own struggles and ask for advice. On the train ride back to Nevada, Delilah was quiet, processing everything. Finally, she said to Preston, "I never wanted to be a symbol or an inspiration. I just wanted to build things that worked." "I know," Preston said gently, "but whether you wanted it or not, you have become both. And that is not a bad thing. If your success helps other women feel like they can pursue their own dreams, then that is a legacy worth having." Delilah nodded slowly. "I suppose you are right. It is strange, though, to think that my life might matter to people I have never met." "Your life has always mattered. Now, more people just know about it." They returned home to find Eleanor managing the business competently in their absence, and James home from university for a visit. The family spent a wonderful week together, and Delilah felt the deep contentment that comes from seeing your children thriving and knowing you played a part in making that possible. As the new century approached, Preston and Delilah began to slow down slightly, delegating more responsibilities to Eleanor and the managers they had trained over the years. They spent more time simply enjoying each other's company, taking long rides into the mountains or sitting on the porch watching sunsets. They had worked hard for decades, building both a business and a family, and now they could reap the rewards of that labor. On New Year's Eve, 1899, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Preston and Delilah stood outside their home under a sky full of stars. James and Eleanor were inside with friends, celebrating the new century with all the optimism of youth. But Preston and Delilah preferred the quiet of the winter night, the cold air crisp in their lungs. "A new century," Delilah marveled. "I wonder what it will bring." "Whatever it brings, we will face it together," Preston said, pulling her close against the cold. "Just like we have faced everything else. Do you ever think about that day I exploded the washing apparatus? How different our lives would be if you had just kept walking." "All the time," Preston admitted, "and I thank whatever force in the universe brought me to your workshop at exactly the right moment. You changed my life, Delilah. You gave me purpose and love and a family. You taught me that home is not something you stumble upon, but something you build with intention and care." "You did the same for me," Delilah said softly. "I was so lonely before you came, even though I did not fully realize it. I had convinced myself that my inventions were enough, that I did not need anything else. But then you showed up and never laughed at my dreams. And suddenly everything was possible." They kissed as the bells in town rang midnight, celebrating the new century. When they broke apart, Preston said, "Here is to the next 100 years." "I do not think we will quite make it that long," Delilah said with a laugh. "Then here is to however many years we get. May they all be as good as the ones we have already had." "I will drink to that," Delilah agreed, and they went inside to join their children, stepping into the new century together, as they had stepped through every other doorway in their lives. The early years of the 20th century brought continued success and some inevitable challenges. Thornton's company faced competition from other manufacturers who tried to copy Delilah's designs, leading to patent disputes that Preston helped navigate with the assistance of lawyers from San Francisco. They won most of the cases, establishing legal precedents that protected other inventors as well. James graduated from university with top honors and returned to Belmont, eager to work alongside his mother. Together, they began developing a new kind of pump system that could draw water from deeper underground sources, potentially opening up farming possibilities in even more arid regions. Eleanor married a banker from Virginia City in 1903, a practical man named Thomas Wright, who understood and supported her ambitions. They settled in Belmont so Eleanor could continue running the business, and their wedding was a joyous affair that reminded Preston and Delilah of their own simple ceremony nearly 2 decades earlier. In 1905, Preston and Delilah became grandparents when Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Ruth. The experience of holding their grandchild filled them both with wonder, seeing the continuation of the family they had built together. James married a year later to a schoolteacher named Margaret, and soon the house was full of multiple generations, all connected by the bonds Preston and Delilah had forged. As they moved into their 50s, Preston and Delilah fully retired from the day-to-day operations of the business, trusting James and Eleanor to carry on the work. They spent their time traveling when they felt like it, working on personal projects that interested them without the pressure of commercial viability, and simply enjoying the life they had created. One afternoon in the spring of 1908, Preston and Delilah returned to the original workshop, now kept more as a museum than a functional space. The newer, larger facilities handled all the actual production, but this shed held too many memories to tear down. They walked through it together, touching equipment they had used 25 years earlier when everything was new and uncertain. "We were so young," Delilah said, running her hand over the workbench where they had rebuilt that first washing apparatus. "So determined and hopeful and naive about how hard it would be." "But we did it anyway," Preston said. "Despite everyone who laughed, despite the failures and the setbacks, we built something real and lasting." "We built several things," Delilah corrected. "A business, a family, a partnership that has sustained us through everything." Preston pulled her into his arms, and they stood there surrounded by the tools of Delilah's trade, the place where they had first become partners and then something more. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you for over 25 years, and I will love you for however many we have left." "I love you too," Delilah replied. "My cowboy who never laughed and always helped test my inventions, even the ones that exploded." They laughed together, the sound echoing in the empty shed, and then walked out into the Nevada sunshine hand in hand. Their story had started with an explosion and a stranger willing to help, and it had become something neither of them could have predicted, but both were grateful for every single day. The years continued to pass gently. Preston's hair turned fully gray, and Delilah developed wrinkles around her eyes from decades of smiling. They watched their grandchildren grow, passed on wisdom when asked, and otherwise let their children live their own lives and make their own mistakes. The business continued to thrive under James and Eleanor's leadership, adapting to new technologies and markets while maintaining the core principles Delilah had established. On their 30th wedding anniversary in October 1913, their family threw them a party that seemed like half of Belmont attended. People gave speeches about Preston and Delilah's contributions to the community, and their children presented them with a leather-bound book containing letters from people all over the West who had been impacted by Delilah's inventions. Women who had been able to start their own businesses because the washing apparatus freed up their time. Farmers who had succeeded in harsh climates thanks to the irrigation systems. Young inventors who had been inspired by Delilah's example to pursue their own dreams, despite opposition. Delilah read through the letters with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the reach of work that had started in a small shed in Nevada. Preston held her as she cried, understanding without words what these letters meant to her. Validation not just of her technical skills, but of her fundamental belief that making things better was worth the struggle. That night, lying in bed with Preston's arm around her, Delilah said, "Thank you for 30 years of partnership and love." "Thank you for giving me a life worth living," Preston replied, "for teaching me that staying in one place is not settling, but building, for showing me what real love looks like." They fell asleep as they had for 3 decades, wrapped around each other, and both felt the deep peace of a life lived fully and well. Preston passed away in his sleep in the winter of 1917, his heart simply giving out one night after a day spent playing with his grandchildren. Delilah woke to find him gone, and the grief hit her like a physical blow. They had been together for 35 years, partners in every sense, and the idea of continuing without him seemed impossible. The family gathered for the funeral, and half the state seemed to show up to pay their respects to the cowboy who had become a pillar of the Belmont community. People told stories about Preston's kindness and his quiet strength, his sharp business sense, and his unwavering support of his wife's ambitions. Delilah listened to all of it in a daze, unable to fully process that Preston was really gone. In the months that followed, Delilah struggled. She had never been alone like this, not since Preston walked into her workshop all those years ago. James and Eleanor were attentive, making sure she ate and did not isolate herself completely. But they could not fill the Preston-shaped hole in her life. She stopped working on new inventions, finding no joy in the process without Preston there to help test her ideas and celebrate her successes. It was James who finally broke through her grief one evening in the spring. He brought drawings to her house, designs for a new kind of grain separator he was developing. "I need your help," he said simply. "I cannot figure out the right mechanism for the rotation, and you are the only person I trust to see what I am missing." Delilah looked at the drawings, her mind automatically engaging with the technical problem, despite her emotional exhaustion. She picked up a pencil and started sketching modifications, explaining her thoughts as James listened intently. For the first time since Preston died, she felt a spark of something beyond grief. "Your father would have suggested a belt drive system here," she said, pointing to a junction point. "He always thought in terms of practical application." "Then that is what we will use," James said. "Will you help me build it?" Delilah looked at her son, seeing Preston in his features and his determination. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I will help you." Working with James on his project gave Delilah a sense of purpose that slowly pulled her out of the worst of her grief. She would never stop missing Preston, never stop wishing he was there beside her, but she could honor his memory by continuing the work they had started together, by mentoring the next generation of inventors and engineers, by living the rest of her life as fully as Preston would have wanted her to. She started volunteering at the local school, teaching basic engineering principles to children, and encouraging the girls especially to consider pursuing technical fields. She wrote articles for magazines about her experiences as a female inventor, hoping to inspire others, and she worked with James on various projects, finding joy in seeing her son carry forward the partnership she and Preston had modeled. Eleanor's children grew, and Delilah poured her love into her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and making sure they understood the legacy he had left. Ruth, Eleanor's eldest, showed an aptitude for mechanics that reminded everyone of Delilah at that age, and Delilah spent hours with her granddaughter teaching her everything she knew. Delilah lived to see the end of World War I, the passage of women's suffrage, and the beginning of the Roaring Twenties. She watched technology advance in ways she had only dreamed about when she was young. Automobiles replacing horses and electricity becoming standard even in small towns like Belmont. She saw her grandchildren grow into capable adults, carrying forward the values she and Preston had instilled. On a warm evening in June 1924, Delilah sat on the porch of the house she and Preston had built together, watching the sun set over the Toquima Range. She was 74 years old, and her body ached in ways it never had when she was young, and building contraptions that exploded. But her mind was still sharp, still spinning with ideas, even though her hands no longer had the strength to build them all. James came out and sat beside her, now a man in his 40s with his own successful career. "How are you feeling, Mother?" "Tired," Delilah admitted, "but content. I have had a good life, James, better than I ever imagined possible. You and Father built something remarkable together. Not just the business, but a family and a legacy that will outlast all of us." Delilah smiled, thinking about Preston. "Your father never laughed at my inventions. Everyone else did at some point, even people who loved me, but not Preston. From the very first day, he took me seriously. He believed in me when I was not sure I believed in myself." "He loved you completely," James said. "Everyone could see it. I loved him the same way, still do, even though he has been gone for years. Love like that does not end just because someone dies." They sat in comfortable silence, and Delilah felt Preston's presence as strongly as if he were sitting beside her. She thought about the girl she had been, alone in her workshop after her father died, convinced her inventions were all she would ever have. She thought about the cowboy who had shown up after an explosion and asked how he could help instead of why she was bothering. She thought about 35 years of partnership and passion, of raising children and building a business, of fighting for her dreams while supporting his. It had been a good life, a life full of love and purpose and accomplishments that mattered. And when Delilah passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months later, she went with a smile on her face, knowing she was going to wherever Preston was waiting. They buried her beside Preston in the Belmont cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Delilah Vaughn Sinclair, inventor and beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, testimony to the impact she had made on the world. James and Eleanor spoke about their parents' love story, about how a chance meeting had led to a partnership that changed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. Ruth, now a young woman studying engineering at university, placed a wrench on her grandmother's grave, a symbol of the tools Delilah had wielded so skillfully throughout her life. "Thank you for showing me it was possible," she whispered. "Thank you for never giving up, even when everyone laughed." The family business continued for decades more, evolving with the times but maintaining the core values Preston and Delilah had established. Their story became part of local legend, the inventor and the cowboy who had built something lasting out of explosions and determination and love that never wavered. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, people swore they could hear laughter coming from the old workshop at the edge of town, the sound of two people who had found exactly what they needed in each other and built a life that would never be forgotten.